What comes to mind when you hear the phrase forbidden knowledge? Maybe you think about secret books, banned ideas, hidden truths, or dangerous information people were never supposed to access. But what if forbidden knowledge was never really about protecting you? What if it was about protecting the system from what happens when you start thinking without permission? Because the most powerful form of surveillance is not when somebody watches your actions, it's when a belief system gets inside your head and teaches you to watch yourself. It's when you start censoring your own questions, policing your own curiosity, and feeling guilty for even wanting to know more than you were told you needed. In that sense, forbidden knowledge is often less about dangerous facts and more about protecting systems from psychologically independent people. It's not just about keeping information out of your hands, it's about keeping certain possibilities out of your mind. Because once people begin asking better questions and reading more deeply and seeing through the architecture of control, they become much harder to govern. And that is what makes this conversation so important today. From ancient myths to modern religion to digital life itself, the real struggle has often not been over knowledge alone, but over who gets to think freely, who gets to question openly, and who gets punished for crossing the boundaries of approved awareness. One of the reasons this conversation matters so much to me is because the struggle over knowledge didn't disappear, it just evolved. We still live in a world where people, platforms, and providers want insight into what we think, what we search, and what keeps us engaged. That's why privacy matters to me, and that's why I use ExpressVPN. I do a lot of research for this channel. I'm constantly digging into religion, history, politics, culture, and all kinds of sensitive material. And I don't think my internet provider or random third parties need a front row seat to that process. ExpressVPN helps by encrypting my traffic and masking my IP address, which gives me a much more private browsing experience. It's also great when you're on public Wi Fi, which can be risky at airports, hotels, and coffee shops because it helps secure your connection there too. And if you want a more open internet, ExpressVPN also lets you change your online location by switching your IP address to one of 105 countries. So, whether your priority is privacy, security, or access, it is a really useful tool to have. Find out how you can get up to 4 extra months by clicking the link in the description box below or scanning the QR code. And if you get a 1 year or 2 year plan through my link, you're also directly supporting this channel. Now, let's get back to the conversation. What's fascinating is that the idea of forbidden knowledge is older than the Bible. And some of the earliest surviving written myths, the issue is not modern censorship or banned books. It's the belief that certain forms of wisdom, life, or power belong to the divine realm and are not meant to be securely possessed by ordinary human beings. And the Mesopotamian myth of Adapa, a figure endowed with great wisdom, is still denied immortality. He stands close to divine knowledge, but access remains limited. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same pattern appears again. A human being reaches toward the secret of overcoming death only to lose the possibility before it can become his. These stories already reflect an ancient concern that there are boundaries humans are not supposed to cross. Then Genesis sharpens the theme even further. In the Eden story, it's not just that something is beyond human reach, knowledge itself becomes morally charged. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is not merely unavailable, it's prohibited. And once the prohibition is broken, the result is shame, fear, and exile. Now, that matters because this is where forbidden knowledge starts to become psychologically powerful. Once a culture teaches that certain knowledge is dangerous not only to possess, but even to seek, control moves inward. The question is no longer just, what are you doing? It becomes, what are you becoming curious about? And that's where the road towards psychological surveillance begins. This final connection is a flawed interpretation built from misunderstanding those ancient themes. What makes these ancient stories so relevant is that the logic didn't stay in the myth. It became social strategy. Once a culture learns how to frame certain kinds of knowledge as dangerous, corrupting, or out of bounds, that idea can be used to regulate people long before they even break a rule. That's where forbidden knowledge stops being just a story about divine boundaries and starts becoming a tool of preemptive social control. In many systems, people aren't only told what they can't do, but what they shouldn't ask, what they shouldn't read, whose voices they should avoid, and which doubts they should never entertain. That's more than ordinary censorship. Censorship tries to block access from the outside. This goes much deeper. It's an attempt to manage consciousness from the inside. The goal is not merely to stop rebellion once it happens, but to prevent the inner conditions that might give rise to rebellion in the first place. This is where psychological surveillance becomes so important. The system doesn't wait for visible disobedience. It doesn't wait for someone to speak out, to leave, to resist, or challenge authority openly. Instead, it trains the person to become their own observer, their own censor, and eventually their own enforcer. The individual learns to watch their thoughts before anyone else has to. They begin filtering their own curiosity, suppressing their own questions, and policing their own internal life in anticipation of judgment. That's why the message in these systems is so powerful and so invasive. It's not simply do not do that, it becomes do not think that, do not question that, don't become curious about that. And if curiosity rises in you anyway, feel ashamed before you ever speak. At that point, control has moved beyond behavior and into your imagination, interpretation, and desire. The person is no longer just following rules, they're learning to distrust their own mind. And that is what makes forbidden knowledge such an effective instrument of social control. It turns curiosity into risk, thought into potential deviance, and silence into a form of obedience. By the time someone might have acted, the system has already been at work inside them, narrowing the range of what they feel safe enough to think. That's not just censorship, this is literally psychological policing. What makes this even more powerful is that the most effective surveillance doesn't require a guard in the room, a camera on the wall, or an authority figure standing over your shoulder. The strongest form of surveillance happens when the watcher has been absorbed into your own mind. At that point, control no longer depends on external enforcement because the individual has learned to carry the system within themselves. The eyes of authority no longer need to remain visibly present because they've already been internalized. This is where forbidden knowledge becomes especially useful to controlling systems. Once people are taught that certain thoughts are dangerous, certain questions are corrupting, and certain lines of inquiry are morally suspect, they begin monitoring themselves long before anyone else has to intervene. Forbidden knowledge creates self surveillance. The person doesn't merely avoid punishment from others, they start preemptively restricting their own intellectual and emotional movement. They learn to hesitate before asking, to retreat before exploring, and to shut down lines of thought that feel too risky to follow. That internalization changes the entire experience of curiosity. Curiosity is no longer felt as a natural expression of intelligence or growth. It starts to feel like exposure, like temptation, like the first step toward betrayal, corruption, or even rebellion. In that kind of environment, the fear of knowing becomes a mechanism of obedience. People begin censoring themselves in private. They don't need to be silenced publicly because they've already learned how to silence themselves internally. Even in solitude, even in silence, even in their own mind, they feel the pressure of being observed. That is what makes this such a rich and painful angle, especially for people coming out of rigid religion. Many people leave the institution before they fully leave the watcher. They may no longer believe the doctrine, but they still feel uneasy asking certain questions. They still feel a flash of guilt when reading forbidden material. They still feel the emotional residue of being watched, judged, or spiritually exposed. That reveals how deep the conditioning actually goes. The system's greatest success was never just getting people to obey in public, it was teaching them to police themselves in private. And that's the real power of the internalized watcher. Once surveillance becomes psychological, the person becomes both prisoner and guard. They carry the fence inside their own consciousness. The system no longer needs constant force because it has trained the individual to participate in their own containment. One of the most powerful ways this dynamic has worked in religious history is through the idea that God is always watching. Not merely watching what you do in public, but watching what you think in private, watching your motives, your temptations, your doubts, your fantasies, your resentments, and even the questions you're too afraid to say out loud. Now, in that kind of environment, a person is never fully alone with themselves. Their inner life is no longer experienced as a private space of reflection, struggle, or discovery. It becomes a morally monitored space. That shift has enormous psychological consequences. It collapses the boundary between inner life and public accountability. In most ordinary settings, there is a difference between what a person thinks and what a person does. But in systems shaped by total divine observation, that distinction begins to erode. A thought can carry the weight of an action. A question can feel like an offense. A temptation can feel like a form of guilt before any behavior has even taken place. The person learns that they're accountable not only for what they have done, but for what has passed through their mind. That's what makes doubt so emotionally intense in those environments. Doubt doesn't feel like a normal part of intellectual development. It feels morally exposed. It feels as though uncertainty itself is being witnessed, evaluated, and recorded. The believer is not merely wrestling with an idea, they're wrestling under observation. That can make even honest reflection feel dangerous because the act of questioning is no longer neutral. It becomes spiritually visible. This also helps explain why confession becomes so central in many religious systems. People are trained not only to regulate behavior, but to report inward deviation. They're encouraged to name suspect thoughts, confess impure motives, and scrutinize their own mental life for signs of rebellion or corruption. Surveillance doesn't remain external when that happens, it becomes participatory. The individual becomes responsible for exposing themselves. They're taught to monitor their own interior world and voluntarily bring its irregularities into the open. What emerges from this is a powerful form of obedience through imagined observation. Even when no human authority is present, the idea of omniscience remains active, the panopticon. The person behaves, restrains themselves, and even interprets their own thoughts within the framework of being watched. This is why this goes deeper than just saying religion is bad. The more serious argument is that some religious systems took the idea of divine omniscience and functionally turned it into a surveillance model. The point was not only theological comfort, it also created a consciousness that could be regulated from the inside out. That's part of what makes this concept so enduring. A God who sees everything can easily become within certain systems more than a source of meaning. That God can become the ultimate watcher, invisible, permanent, inescapable, and lodged deep within the believer's psychological world. At that point, obedience is no longer secured only through rules or community pressure, it's secured through the feelings that the mind itself is always being observed. Now, another reason systems treat certain knowledge as dangerous is because knowledge doesn't merely inform people, it transforms them. Once a person gains access to information that recontextualizes their world, they do not remain the same kind of subject that they were before. Knowledge can rearrange loyalty, alter self understanding, expose manipulation, and weaken the emotional grip of an institution. That's why forbidden knowledge is so often tied to identity containment. The threat is not just that people will learn something new, it's that they will become something new. This is especially true when the knowledge in question exposes the hidden architecture of the system itself. Once a person begins to learn the institution's actual history, the contradictions within its doctrine, the political motives buried beneath its moral language, or the psychological and physiological mechanics behind what were once treated as mystical experiences, they become much harder to govern, like I did. They're no longer operating only from reverence, fear, or inherited trust. Now they're operating with context, and context is destabilizing to systems that depend on innocence, dependence, or selective ignorance. That's why institutions often frame certain material as spiritually, morally, or emotionally dangerous. On the surface, the warnings sound protective. It sounds like concern for the individual soul, the individual heart, or even the individual well being. But beneath that warning is often a deeper institutional anxiety. The real danger is not always what the knowledge will do to the person, it's what the knowledge will do to the person's relationship with authority. Once people can explain the system to themselves more clearly than the system can explain itself to them, obedience becomes much harder to maintain. This is where the distinction becomes sharp. What gets labeled as forbidden knowledge is often not soul threatening knowledge for the person, it is identity threatening knowledge for the institution. If it threatens the story the institution tells about itself, it threatens the moral legitimacy of its authority. It threatens the emotional dependence that keeps people loyal. And because identity is one of the deepest layers of social control, anything that gives people the power to reinterpret themselves outside of the institution's framework will almost always be treated as dangerous. That's why this kind of knowledge feels so disruptive. It doesn't just answer questions, it creates distance. It gives people enough perspective to say, I'm not who this system told me I was, or this moral language was doing political work, or what I thought was spiritual mystery may have been social conditioning, emotional contagion, or power management. At that point, the institution is no longer simply managing information, it's fighting to preserve identity boundaries. So, forbidden knowledge often functions as a defense mechanism for institutional survival. The institution names certain truths as corrupting because those truths loosens its hold over the people inside it. The more clearly a person can see how the system works, the less likely they are to remain psychologically fused with it. And once that fusion begins to break, governing becomes much more difficult. What makes authoritarian systems especially effective is that they often don't stop at condemning certain conclusions. They go further and moralize the very impulse to inquire. Instead of simply saying that a particular idea is false, they train people to experience the desire to investigate as a sign of danger in itself. In that kind of environment, curiosity is no longer treated as a normal part of learning, growth, or discernment. It's recast as spiritual weakness, a moral defect, or the beginning of rebellion. That shift is incredibly important because it changes the target of control. The system is no longer dealing only with what people believe or what they do. It's now reaching deeper into the level of desire itself. Wanting to know becomes suspect. Asking questions becomes a sign of pride. Exploring alternatives becomes dangerous. Doubt becomes contamination. The person is not merely warned about bad information. They're taught to distrust the parts of themselves that reaches towards understanding in the first place. This is one of the most sophisticated forms of psychological surveillance because it moves beyond managing outward behavior and begins regulating inward appetite. A person doesn't need to be caught reading the wrong book or listening to the wrong voice if they've already been conditioned to feel guilty for even wanting to. The system's power increases dramatically once curiosity itself begins to trigger shame. At that point, the person is not just avoiding forbidden material, they're suppressing the instinct that might have led them to it. That's why moralizing curiosity is such a powerful authoritarian move. It fuses epistemology with ethics. The question is no longer only whether something is true or false. The deeper question becomes whether you are a good or bad person for even wanting to know. Once that happens, the search for understanding becomes emotionally loaded long before it becomes intellectual. The individual starts to experience inquiry not as freedom, but as temptation. They feel the need to justify their questions before they even follow them. This pushes surveillance into a much deeper layer of consciousness. The system is no longer merely tracking what you do. Now it's trying to regulate what you want to know. It's attempting to shape not only your actions, but your orientation toward knowledge itself. This is what makes this such a deep form of control. The person begins censoring not just speech, not just reading habits, but desire. They're trained to feel that healthy curiosity is dangerous and that the safest version of themselves is the one that does not reach too far. And once a system can make curiosity feel corrupt, it's gained extraordinary power. It no longer has to fight every question with an argument. It only has to make the questioner feel guilty for asking. That is psychological surveillance at one of its deepest levels because the person is now guarding the borders of their own mind, not simply out of fear of punishment, but out of fear that the desire to know says something morally wrong about who they are. The Eden story may be the clearest and most enduring archetype of forbidden knowledge in the Western imagination because it brings all of these dynamics together in a single narrative. Knowledge is restricted, the seeker is warned, the crossing of the boundary is treated as disobedience. Expanded awareness is followed by shame, fear, and expulsion. The structure is remarkably powerful because it does more than just tell a story about a bad decision. It creates a model of controlled consciousness, a framework in which there are limits around what human beings should know and where safety is located not in understanding, but in obedience. That is part of what gives the story such long term psychological force. Before the fruit is eaten, the human pair exists within a world defined by trust and prohibition. There's a boundary, and the meaning of that boundary is not to be investigated, but respected. Once that boundary is crossed, the result is not enlightenment in any triumphant sense, it is exposure. Their eyes are open, but what follows is vulnerability, self consciousness, and punishment. In that sense, the story doesn't present expanded awareness as liberation. It presents it as a dangerous transition that destabilizes innocence and brings suffering into view. This is why the Eden narrative works so well as the backbone. It's not simply a story about rule breaking, it's a story about what happens when the desire to know overrides the command to trust. The act of knowing becomes morally charged, curiosity becomes entangled with transgression. Awareness becomes costly. And once that pattern is absorbed into a culture, it can shape how people think far beyond the story. It can teach that there are boundaries around human awareness that are not just practical, but sacred, and that crossing them puts the self at risk. Psychologically, that matters because it makes knowledge feel dangerous at the level of identity. The person is not just told, don't do this, they're shown that the movement from innocence to awareness carries pain, alienation, and judgment. Politically and socially, that has enormous utility. A story like this can function as more than theology. It can become a control template for warning people away from certain forms of inquiry. It can normalize the idea that not all questions are safe, that not all insight is good for you, and that obedience is often a better path than understanding. What if the story is not just about sin in the abstract? What if it also helped normalize the idea that there are limits to human awareness that people should fear crossing? What if the emotional force of the story helped train generations of people to associate disobedient knowing with danger itself? In that reading, Eden is not just about the origins of sin. It's also about the social and psychological management of curiosity. That means the story carries a structure that is often used as a tool of surveillance. It dramatizes a world in which restricted knowledge, moral warning, transgressive curiosity, and punitive consequences are tightly linked. That's exactly what makes it such a gold mine. It gives you a narrative architect where the fear of crossing epistemic boundaries is woven directly into the meaning of being human. And that's why Eden still echoes so strongly in modern consciousness. Even for people who no longer believe the story literally, its structure lingers. The idea that some knowledge is dangerous, that questioning can make you exposed, and that innocence is safer than awareness has shaped moral imagination for centuries. In that sense, the Eden story is not just an ancient myth about the past. It's one of the most influential stories ever told about why human beings should be afraid of knowing too much. The modern version of this story no longer depends on priests, prophets, or elders standing over people in explicitly sacred spaces. Today, psychological surveillance is increasingly woven into digital life through platforms that collect enormous amounts of behavioral data, analyze patterns of attention and engagement, and build systems designed to predict and influence user behavior. In 2024, the US Federal Trade Commission said major social media and video streaming services had engaged in vast surveillance of users in order to monetize personal information. And its accompanying report describes business models built around predicting, shaping, and monetizing human behavior. Now, that matters because these systems are not merely recording what people already believe, they are learning impulses, identifying triggers, and adjusting what people see in ways that can shape what they feel, click, disclose, and return to. Research on digital media has shown that platform environments can alter users' perceived norms and influence their own disclosure behavior, while scholarship on emotion recognition notes that digital systems increasingly infer and harvest emotions from online behavior and related signals. In other words, the system is not just observing the user, it's studying how to steer the user more effectively. In older religious frameworks, the pressure often came from the belief that an unseen intelligence knew your thoughts, judged your motives, and monitored your deviations. In modern digital systems, the mechanism is different, but the structure can feel strongly familiar. Invisible processes track behavior, build profiles, infer vulnerabilities, and feed people content optimized to keep them engaged, reactive, or dependent. The Federal Trade Commission's recent work on commercial surveillance and surveillance pricing makes clear that contemporary systems are not only collecting data, but also using personal characteristics and behavioral information to shape market treatment and user experience. Both supernatural surveillance and digital surveillance thrive on the management of attention, behavior, and perceived deviance. One tells you that your inner life is visible to an all seeing power, the other builds technical systems that approximate that logic in commercial form, continuously observing signals, modeling likely responses, and optimizing environments around what keeps you predictable. That's what makes the modern version so important for today's conversation. We may have moved from supernatural surveillance to digital surveillance, but in both cases, the deeper issue is the shaping of consciousness through the feeling that you are knowable, readable, and governable from the inside out. Shame is one of the most effective forms of social control because it allows communities to enforce norms without needing constant physical surveillance. Once shame has been deeply installed, the system no longer has to rely on someone always watching from the outside. The individual begins to carry the pressure within themselves. They monitor their own behavior, restrain their own impulses, and silence their own questions because the threat is no longer only punishment from others. It's the fear of becoming the wrong kind of person in the eyes of the community. That's why shame can be understood as a form of emotional surveillance. It doesn't simply tell people what the rules are. It makes them feel exposed when they drift too close to violating them. It creates an internal alarm system that goes off before action ever becomes visible. A person doesn't need to be publicly corrected if they've already learned how to shrink themselves in private. In that sense, shame functions as internalized policing. It keeps people small, quiet, and predictable, not by force alone, but by making deviation feel humiliating at the level of identity. This becomes even more powerful when forbidden knowledge enters the picture. The danger is no longer limited to what a person does with information. The suspicion begins much earlier at the level of desire. If a system teaches that certain questions are corrupting, that certain sources are dangerous, or that certain forms of curiosity signal rebellion, then shame begins attaching itself not just to transgression, but to inquiry. The person starts to feel marked simply for wanting to know. Even before they read the book, ask the question, or follow the doubt, they feel the emotional weight of suspicion. That's what makes forbidden knowledge such a powerful amplifier of shame. It tells people that even wanting to know makes them suspect. Curiosity is no longer experienced as a human instinct toward growth or understanding. It's a warning sign, a possible stain on the self. The individual begins to wonder what their questions reveal about them, morally, spiritually, or even socially. And once that happens, shame has already done the work. The person is not merely avoiding consequences, they're guarding their own mind against lines of thought that might make them feel contaminated. This is why shame is such an effective surveillance technology. It reaches deeper than rules because it operates through self perception. It teaches people not only to fear judgment, but to preempt it by narrowing themselves. It tells them to stay within approved boundaries, not just for safety, but for dignity, belonging, and worth. And when shame is attached to forbidden knowledge, the result is especially potent. The community doesn't have to suppress every question by hand because the person has already learned to blush at their own curiosity. In that way, shame becomes one of the quietest and most powerful tools of psychological control. It turns the individual into their own guard and their own censor, and sometimes even their own accuser. The system no longer needs chains when it can make people feel that stepping beyond the boundary would make them unclean, disloyal, or unworthy. That's what gives shame its enduring power. It doesn't just stop behavior, it shapes the kind of self a person feels permitted to be. And that's an assault on personal autonomy. Many people leave religion intellectually long before they leave it emotionally, socially, or even neurologically. They may no longer accept the doctrines, no longer trust the institution, and no longer identify with the system that shaped them, yet still feel its presence in their body. They still hesitate around certain questions. They still feel guilty when exploring certain ideas. They still experience anxiety when challenging assumptions that once felt sacred. The theology may be gone, but the reflex remains. That's what makes this so important after deconstruction. A person can walk away from the institution and still carry its watcher inside them. They may know rationally that no one is monitoring their thoughts, but psychologically, they still feel exposed. They may no longer believe a book is dangerous, but they still feel uneasy opening it. They may reject the old moral framework, but still feel a flash of fear when thinking beyond it. That reveals how deeply this system worked on them. Its power was never limited to beliefs on paper. It moved through repetition, emotion, shame, fear, and identity until it became embedded in the nervous system itself. This is why deconstruction can feel so disorienting. It's not only the loss of old answers, it's the unraveling of an internal structure that once organized safety, belonging, and self perception. When people say they still feel watched after leaving religion, they often don't mean it literally. They mean that the emotional architecture of being watched is still active within them. The sense of caution, the anticipatory guilt, the instinct to self censor, and the fear of crossing invisible lines can remain long after the formal belief system has collapsed. The surveillance lingers because it was never just theological, it was psychological. People begin to wonder why they still feel nervous reading certain material. They wonder why asking honest questions still produces shame. They wonder why the old fear can still rise even when they no longer believe the thing that once justified it. The answer is that systems of control often outlast belief because they don't only occupy the mind, they trained the body, they shape reflexes, they create emotional habits that keep firing even after the worldview that built them has been rejected. So, one of the deepest truths after deconstruction is this: you can leave the institution before the institution leaves your nervous system. You can outgrow the doctrine before you fully outgrow the fear. You can reject the theology before your body learns that curiosity is indeed safe. And that matters because healing after religion is not just about changing your mind, it's about teaching your whole self that you're no longer under that kind of watch, no longer required to fear your own questions, and no longer obligated to treat your curiosity like a threat. That's why this conversation is bigger than theology. It's about recovery. It's about understanding why freedom can still feel frightening after control is gone. And it's about helping people recognize that the lingering discomfort they feel is not proof that they were wrong to leave. It's evidence of how deeply the system trained them to carry its surveillance within. Hey, if this conversation helped you think a little deeper, see a little clearer, or put words to something you've been carrying for a long time, then help us keep building this kind of work. This channel exists to create thoughtful, liberating, people centered conversations for those navigating life beyond fear, beyond control, and most importantly, beyond superstition. And the truth is, this kind of work takes community. So if you believe in what we're doing here, there are a few powerful ways to support the channel. First, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and share it with somebody who you feel needs it. That helps this content travel further than you might even realize. Second, if you want to support more directly, check out the links in the description for ways to give, join, or partner with this work more consistently. Whether that's becoming a member, joining Patreon, grabbing a digital resource, or simply showing up and staying engaged, every form of support helps us keep growing. We're not just trying to make videos, we're trying to build something meaningful for people learning how to think freely and live fully. So if that matters to you, help us keep rising. Support the channel, support the work, and let's keep building the kind of spaces that many of us wish existed sooner. Thank you for hanging out with me today. And as always, until next time, keep rising.